Spring is fast approaching and trout fishing season is upon us. So it's time to gear up. And the first thing we usually do is spool up with new line. But do you ever go into your sporting goods store and feel super overwhelmed by all of the different fishing line choices? Do you ever pick a line and then realize that maybe it was the wrong choice and it's costing you fish? Well, you're not alone, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about in this video, and we're going to help you decide which line is best for trout fishing. So stick around and let's begin. Hey everybody, welcome to the Fishing Duo. Fishing line is probably one of the most important parts of your entire setup, and choosing the right one could make the difference between success or failure on the water. So whether you're trolling for stock trout on a local lake, casting spinners in a mountain stream for wild cutthroat, or just fishing from shore, there's almost always a line that will be superior to all others. And that's my job in this video, is to help simplify that decision, because once you pick the right line, fishing gets a whole lot easier. And if you stick around till the end, I'll show you the one line that we think is the most versatile line for almost all trout fishing situations. Alright, so how do you pick the best fishing line for trout? Well, the first step is to understand that you actually have three general choices to choose from. You have monofilament lines, fluorocarbon lines, and braid. Now each have different pros and cons to consider when it comes to fishing for trout. And we're going to talk a little bit about each. I know you've probably heard these comparisons many times, but we just need to touch on it a little bit as it pertains to trout fishing. When comparing fishing lines, you do have to understand that there's a few key characteristics that make it effective for trout fishing. The first is manageability, and that means it needs to cast smooth and have minimal memory. Next is durability. You need a line that can resist some abrasion against structure, because when you're trout fishing, you're going to be casting around rocks or other structure, and you don't want it to fail on you. It should also maintain good knot strength, and durability also means that it'll survive more than a season or two, because your line's going to be exposed to moist environments and sun, dirt, or other things that can weaken the line over time. The last key characteristic of any good trout fishing line is invisibility, because trout are line-shy fish. And while it's not always critical in all situations, there is times when you're going to appreciate a low visibility line. Let's start our comparisons off with talking about monofilament line, because this is by far the most popular fishing line out there for all sorts of fish, including trout. And there's good reasons for that, but it isn't without its flaws. Because while monofilament has a reasonable amount of manageability, it does have a fair bit of line memory built into it, which means it's going to cause some tangles and twists over time. It's also not the most durable fishing line of the three, because some nicks or abrasions in it will definitely weaken it, and you might lose a fish or two if you don't replace it at least every season or two. Although, when it comes to invisibility, monofilament is actually a pretty good performer. Plus, it helps that you can go into any tackle shop and find a variety of colors to match your fishing situation. Next up, let's talk about braid, because over the last few years, I've really become a big fan of using braid in almost all of my fishing applications, not just for trout. And that's because it is by far one of the most manageable lines I've ever used. All the line memory issues you have with mono don't exist with braid. It is very easy to work with. It also casts a nautical mile, so when casting distance matters, you're going to want some braid. It is also probably one of the most durable fishing lines I have ever used, because even minor nicks or abrasions on the line don't seem to weaken it in any noticeable way, which means I get several seasons out of one spool of line. But where braid absolutely bombs is on the invisibility front, because in ultra clear water, braid stands out like a sore thumb, so it's not ideal in those situations for trout fishing. But we're talking about braid in this video for a reason, because it does have a place for trout anglers. And it specifically comes in handy in deep water applications, like if you're jigging for lake trout, where you need that sensitivity, because braid has virtually no stretch, which means you feel every bite. Braid also has a place in trolling for trout, because its thin diameter for a similar weight strength as you might find in mono means it cuts through water better, getting your gear deeper when you're not fishing with a downrigger. So if you primarily fish for trout in clear water situations, then you're probably going to want to avoid braid because it's just too visible in the water. However, for most any other trout fishing situation out there, it's an excellent choice, and I definitely encourage you to try it, because you can also pair it up with a fluorocarbon or monofilament leader and get all the invisibility you need. Now, I saved fluorocarbon line for last because it's kind of a unique beast, and my experience with it is kind of mixed. It definitely has its perks, but it also is a difficult line to use, primarily because it is not the most manageable of all three. While it has a similar memory to mono, it's a lot stiffer, so it makes it a very difficult line to work with on a spinning reel. Yet it is a highly durable line, right up there with braid. It can handle some pretty decent abrasion before it weakens enough to break. Now I know I'm kind of making fluorocarbon sound like a bad choice, but in the world of trout fishing, it definitely should not be overlooked, because there is no line as invisible as fluorocarbon. It actually has the same refractive index as water, so once it goes beneath the water, you're not gonna see it, and neither will the trout. A big part of making sure you pick the right line is understanding which species of trout you target the most, because obviously what works for smaller stocked rainbow trout isn't going to work for giant lake trout. You're going to need to ask yourself, are you casting small spinners in mountain streams, or are you trolling stained urban lakes for big brown trout? Because half the battle in picking the right line is understanding which type of trout fishing you enjoy most. But I can help you narrow it down a little bit, because most of the time your line choice for different species is going to come down to choosing the appropriate line weight. Generally, light line in the 2 to 6 pound test range is perfect for average sized trout in the 14 to 20 inch range. You're going to want to bump it up to something like 8 or 10 pound test when you're trolling or fishing for much larger trout. And if you plan to target trophy brown trout or big lake trout, then you're definitely going to want to choose a mono or braid 20 pound test or higher. Once you've worked out which kind of trout you're actually going to encounter the most, you can actually look at some specific fishing situations to decide which line is going to be the best. In our neck of the woods, many of our lakes, especially our alpine lakes and our mountain streams, have ultra clear water. And in order to present our lures as naturally as possible to those trout that thrive there, we've got to have invisible line, which means we're going to be using fluorocarbon, either as a leader or a main line. And we like it around the 4 pound test range. Maybe we'll bump it up to 6 pound test if we think there's larger fish there. Now, monofilament is a close second, but we generally step down the weight just a little bit. 2 pound test at a minimum, up to about 4 pound test, and that usually serves us pretty well in some of our clear waters. You definitely can get away with less than perfection when you're fishing for trout in stained or dirty water. Not even braid affects your presentation like it does in clear water. But you can't get complacent here, because you still need to try to match your line color to the water color. And this is where monofilament wins out, because it has the largest selection of colors to choose from. And we generally opt for a clear or green color line, which matches a diverse range of watercolors that we fish. Spinners and spoons are some of the most successful lures for catching trout that have ever been created. Think of rooster tails, panther martin, meps, needlefish, little Cleos, or the Thomas buoyant spoon. They are amazing lures, and you definitely need some in your tackle box. But in order to fish these lures effectively, you're going to need a light line with low memory and smooth casting. That's why we generally use 2 to 4 pound test monofilament. 2-pound test when the water is very clear, 4-pound test for almost any other situation. Now you could also go with fluorocarbon, but the problem with fluorocarbon is that it's just not as manageable as monofilament. So that's why monofilament in this case gets the edge. There are times when soaking your bait in one spot is the ideal way to target trout. Whether you're fishing with a bobber or sliding sinker rig, the goal is the same, to get your bait suspended at a depth where cruising trout are feeding. Now with a sliding sinker rig, the goal is to get your bait just off the bottom. And in order to do that, you're going to need a leader that has some natural buoyancy. And for this, you're going to want monofilament. It does have a tendency to stay buoyant. And 4-pound test mono has never let us down in this still fishing application. Now fluorocarbon might seem like a better choice, but the problem is it's a slightly denser line and it will sink and pull your bait to the bottom. If you're fishing with a bobber, that's not so critical. So we do actually encourage you to use a fluorocarbon leader. Something in the 4-pound test range should work. Now for the main line, it really doesn't matter. You could get away with using braid, mono, or even a high-vis yellow or green line, which some anglers actually prefer because when a trout takes your bait, that high visibility lets you see that movement as soon as it happens. One of our favorite ways to fish for trout is with trolling gear. We use a variety of things like gang trolls, spoons, crankbaits, spinners, flies, or worm harnesses. But regardless of what we use, how I intend to get my gear down to where the fish are is what determines our line choice. Now mono and braid are both great when we're using weights or divers or downriggers, and depending on the species, 10 to 12 pound test is sufficient. And we always pair that up with a mono or fluoro leader. But if you don't have a downrigger, then you might consider braid because it cuts through the water a little better with that thinner diameter and will get you down deeper. Now when you're long line trolling, you can use mono, braid, or even a lead core line if that's what you choose. Spring, summer, and fall aren't the only times to fish for trout. In fact, some of the best trout fishing I've ever had has been through the ice. And choosing a line for ice fishing is actually pretty straightforward because at the end of the day, what you really need is an invisible line in clear water. You need something that's manageable when the temperatures are cold, and you need a little bit of abrasion resistance because that line is going to drag along some sharp edges on the ice. And for that, 4 to 6 pound test monofilament has never let me down. I've hauled up some fat rainbows and feisty tiger trout through the ice with 4-pound test monofilament. Now fluorocarbon is also a good choice as a leader material because it has some extra resistance to scraping along that ice fishing hole. But I wouldn't necessarily use it as a main line because it gets pretty stiff in the cold. The other exception to that is when I'm fishing in deep water. Mostly ice fishing for trout happens in shallow water, but occasionally you need to reach down deep, and I want some sensitivity and good solid hook sets that comes with that zero stretch braided line. Well, that about sums up all the different types of trout fishing situations you might encounter and the lines we think are best for each of them. But remember when I promised at the beginning of the video that I'd show you the one line that could do almost all your trout fishing? Well, here it is. 4-pound test monofilament is probably the most versatile fishing line we have ever used. We can start out our trout fishing season trolling light tackle, then transition right into still fishing or casting spinners and spoons in ultra clear water. Then we could jump into ice fishing season and catch plenty of trout through the ice, all without re-spooling our reel. Obviously, this line isn't going to work in every situation, but for the majority of trout fishing situations, 4-pound test monofilament won't let you down. So if you're new to trout fishing, I encourage you to give it a try because I can almost guarantee you'll start catching more trout. And since we're talking about spooling up with new line, you should go check out our video on how to spool up a spinning reel without line twists or tangles, because we've got some good tips on there that'll definitely spare you some frustration. So I'll leave a link up here and a link in the description below where you can watch that video. Thanks everyone for sticking around and watching this video, which hopefully helps simplify the process of you choosing a line. And if you think we succeeded, please consider subscribing and give us a like, because this is the kind of content we like to make, the stuff that helps you catch more fish. And if you need more fishing advice, don't forget to check out fishingduo.com. And until next time, we'll see you on the water.